Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, on my quest for England, and I'm still in search of Sussex and still following in the footsteps of Arthur Stanley Cook in his book Off the Beaten Track, and I'm on chapter 5. And if you've been following this series, you'll know that I've taken a walk from Devil's Dyke across the Downs, and I've come now from the Downs down into the village of Southwick, through the infill of houses which spreads to Upper Kingston Lane and then comes down. And I'm here now at this very lovely church, St Michael's and All of the Angels, because there's some interesting facts here to tell you about, but also Arthur has a little look round here. And as we know, Arthur's very keen on organs. He used to play the organ, and of course churches by default. And I will be continuing to Kingston as well, which is only a stone's throw to the south west. Arthur brings us down Kingston Lane, which is from the route that he comes off the South Downs. And as he comes down Kingston Lane and he makes his way to the south, of which the area is free of the buildings that we now see there, that started, as I mentioned in the last episode, in the 30s and then more in the 60s as more of the South Downs becomes encroached. He comes to a point and he talks about a view, and in fact he's with a chap who I think is called Swain, and Swain is a photographer. Now in the book he refers to Swain as T'other, the other person who's with him. And they decide to sketch this view. Well, he sketches the view. T'other, who's the photographer, decides to take a photograph at the same time. It's apparently a grey day, and the view that they look at is marred by the fact that it's grey, but also T'other, the photographer, says, wouldn't it be better if there was a figure in the photograph to give some sort of scale? And at that moment they see some school children coming along, and they think, we'll get those to sit down, look like they're having a picnic or actually reading to each other and having a nice time. And they settle them by a gate across this view to the church in the background. So there's a photograph that's in extant, which I believe is taken by a chap called Swain, and then there's the sketch, and they are identical, absolutely identical. So we think that must be him. So I wanted to see if this view is still there, because Arthur calls it an old favourite. It's a view that a lot of people seem to recognise, and there must have been some photograph or something prior to them coming along and taking theirs. So I've gone down there and have a look. Well, sadly, this rather idyllic view is no longer there. There's a great big hedge in the way, and as try as you can't see the church spire in the background at all. In fact, you can't see anything. So this is Southwick. Southwick's about 5 miles from Brighton. It's probably about 10 miles from Worthing in the west, and that's where I live, and it's on the coast. So come down the Downs, as you saw. Arthur doesn't really tell us too much about Southwick. He's more interested in the church and the inside and some of the history, and of course we can't go in the church, which is a bit of a shame at the moment. But I think they are going to open up the churches fairly soon. Anyway, it is mentioned in the Domesday Book as Esmere Witch, but it soon becomes Southwick, and I think the first notes in history is around, well, depends which source you see, because there's one source that says it's 1073 and another one says 1309, so take your pick. There's lots of other interesting things. There's a house here called King Charles Cottages, and it's believed, or the legend goes, that King Charles II, when he was fleeing for France after immediately after the English Civil War, he made his way, and of course there's the famous route, the Monarch's Way, and he got down to Southwick and he spent the night in that cottage. which is a lovely story if true. And the cottage, it is old enough for that to have taken place. The houses in the area would have, and the population, I suppose, would have originally been a small port, and then built up in about the 1850s to become a much more substantial place. It's got a village green, and actually Arthur mentions the village green. The railway came in the 1940s, and I gather that the railway must have been coming from Brighton, that Southwick was going to be the terminus. But of course we know it extends right along the coast to, to Worthing, and then to Chichester, and so on and so forth. Oh, and the Romans were here, and in various points on the downs there are notes on the OS map that the Romans had been here. Roman remains had been found. To the north there was a Roman burial ground that was found, and there was a villa here which I believe is pretty much now where Manor Hall Road is, and in that area. So a place of antiquity and interest which would have fascinated Arthur back in the day. In 1941, I think it is, some 30 years after the book is published, 20 years in fact after Arthur's death, he dies in 1919, sadly, we're in the Second World War. And during the Second World War, as we know, we were bombed. And in Southwick, along with Brighton and Worthing and Shoreham, and I guess mainly because there is a port in Shoreham, bombs were coming and there was a raid. And one bomb hit the church. It went through the church and didn't go off. So the bomb disposal squad came in, but they couldn't find the bomb. Where was it? They hunted and they hunted and they couldn't find it. They could see where it had come in, but they couldn't see where it had gone. And of course you have an unexploded bomb, and by that time in 1941 a lot of these bombs could be timed, and so you had a bomb that could go off a day later, possibly 2 or 3 days later, who knew? So you could wait for it to go off, but eventually if it didn't, you had to find it because it could be unstable and just go off whenever it wants. But they couldn't find it. So in the end, they had to take the tower down, and they took the tower, numbering each of the stones, and they dismantled the tower and searched again for the bomb, and still they couldn't find it. Well, it wasn't until 2 years later, in 1943, that they did find it, and I believe it was to the north, just outside the North Aisle, where it had come down. So it must have come, I think, from over that direction, through the tower and down, and it was just outside the North Aisle. And when I came and did a recce the other day, I spoke to, I think it must have been the church warden, and he said, yeah, it was about 40 foot down, which does sound extremely deep, but these things did thud down and cause a lot of chaos. Well, they had rebuilt the tower, but what a remarkable story. The bomb, once it had been found, was for a while put on display after it had been disarmed in the church. We mentioned the earlier view that you can no longer see. There's a second view in the book, which also I was keen to replicate, and I have made a video where I've made a little recce to see if I could find the actual buildings. And this is of the forge, and it's got in his sketch of the forge, which is looking from the green this way, a board on it that says Sea West. And I wanted to see if the forge was still there, and in the video I have a look round and to see that the forge is still there. And I tried to find out if there was any information about this, the blacksmith presumably, who was called Sea West, Charles West, Cecil West, who knows. I couldn't find anything, but it's interesting. Again, the forge is there, the view is there, but unfortunately you can't see the church tower and the steeple or the spire, but the view is still there, which is great. Just to interrupt the flow of the piece, I've just been talking to a gentleman as I was taking the pictures of what Arthur calls the old forge, but actually it's interesting. He says no, it wasn't a forge. People often call it a forge, but it wasn't a forge. The forge is further north up, facing the green. This was the old wheelwright. So a little bit of local knowledge there. And he said, yeah, and it must have been relatively recently, because he says I've got pictures of him with chickens and various things climbing over the walls, and even in earlier days was cleaning out his brushes in the foreground. And the gentleman I spoke to must have been, I don't know, my sort of age, maybe a bit older, but in living memory. So that's a fascinating little addition. Say John Payne somebody or other, 1738, in the wall there. Just down the road from St Michael's and All the Angels, and from Southwick, is Kingston, or Kingston Bucy, or Kingston by Sea. See what I did there? Kingston is by the sea, and for a while the Bucy part was believed to mean Kingston by Sea, but that's not actually what it derives from. One of the manors held for the Normans when they came in was Robert de Bucy. It just sounds like by sea, and it happens to be relatively close to the sea, and actually quite opposite the Shoreham Harbour entrance. This is St Julian's Church, and a beautiful old church, complete with an anchorite cell. Like both of these churches, the proximity is actually very, very close, and like both of these churches, they were probably buildings here in Saxon times, most likely a wooden structure. This was built in brick, I think from the 13th century onwards, again mentioned in the Domesday Book, and now of course, you know, big flint, rubble, stone, sandstone. Very easy to bring the materials for building if you wanted to, but it looks like this was just built of local materials. So interesting. Lots of different parts of remodelling, but it's the proximity that's you know, they're incredibly close, the two churches and the two villages. So most likely two Saxon villages that now, with the urban conurbation and ribbon development and everything, if you wouldn't even know you've walked from Southwick into Kingston Bucy. And it's interesting because lots of these authors writing at that time, at the beginning of the 1900s and the 1920s and 30s, are talking about this encroachment into the land and lots of very similar shabby utilitarian type houses. There's a gate just over there. It looks relatively new really, but it would have probably led to the old manor house, which is over there. It's now Shoreham College, but the old manor building, which has been since replaced, I think rebuilt in the 13th, 14th century, or in the 18th century. I think these places just continually get either pulled down or rebuilt, is there, just this side really of the railway line, and that's where Robert de Bucy, or Robert Bucy, would have hung out. But if we carry on south, we'll go past the railway, which runs parallel to the coast, and it's quite high on an embankment, and then on the other side, what would have been back in Arthur's time, a much more quieter, 100 years ago, quieter, quite marine-based sort of village. Well, here we go. This is on the seafront. This is where Arthur pretty much finishes his walk, and it's the finish of my walk. We get down to the entrance to Shoreham Harbour, and we can see the entrance there. To the right of the harbour, we've got Shoreham Fort, which I've made videos about before. It's a Palmerston fort which was sort of built, never saw action. It's just in the distance there, in the late 1900s. We've got the lighthouse, which was built in 1840. Arthur would have seen that, and apparently the light from the lighthouse at the end of the shore could be seen 10 nautical miles out at sea. So not bad for a lovely old Victorian lighthouse. And then looking this way, we used to have the power station that looked like the Battersea power station with the twin chimneys and puffed out all that horrible coal. Well, we've got the modern power station now that way, and what I think they call the Shoreham Canal, which is the way that the boats come in and they get to their docks. Fascinating place. I've walked a little bit around there in another video, so I'll put links to all of that if I remember. So this is the end of this little series. I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up and give me a like, become a patron, support what I do, and I'll be out on another walk very soon. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. Bye bye for now.